Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about issue number 2 and 3 of Jean Grey, written by Louise Simonson. But before we get started with the story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you find anything interesting within the comics covered here, for with your help, this channel can grow and improve. So with that out there, this issue opens when Jean chooses wisely to forget about the future and to return to the past and let her story play out in an unbroken line, until she ran into yet another pivotal moment of decision-making. And that was when the new X-Men returned from space in a shuttle during a solar flare that could kill almost anyone. Now during this time, Professor X was psychically incapacitated, but despite that, they weren't worried, for the shuttle had a shield containment room that was safe inside, until shrapnel damaged the shuttle's autopilot. So if the rest of them were to survive, one of them would have to face a certain death, which includes mentally piloting the shuttle into Earth's protective atmosphere. Now, when this first went down, things played out a lot differently. In the original timeline, an argument ensued which led to Jean Grey using a psychic attack on Cyclops. And then when it came to her and Wolverine, she eventually pulled her rank on him, due to him being the new guy on the roster. So with the ball in Jean's court, she quickly exits the shuttle and pilots it all the way down to the surface. All the way until she was unable to withstand the radiation any longer, and with her last breath, she cried out for help right before the shuttle crashed into the bay. Now luckily, everyone survived the impact, and as for Jean Grey, she emerged as the Phoenix, triumphant but not quite herself. Now, at the time, none of them knew she was possessed by a symbiotic power that was drawn to passion and thrived in the darkest corners of her soul and reveled in destruction. But see, that was only their first encounter. So with that said, on the very next page, we jump back to Jean Grey at that moment, before everything went wrong, before the shuttle went down. And unlike her previous choice to do it herself, Jean decided to allow another member to take the lead. Jean allowed Wolverine to steer the shuttle. Now, in all honesty, Wolverine was a great choice to do this, given the fact that he had a healing factor that would allow him to survive the radiation of re-entry. So, while Wolverine took the cockpit, the rest of the team settled down in the shield compartment and waited. So if everything's set to go, Wolverine opens his mind to Jean. And by doing that, she was able to see through his eyes. Jean is able to see the dials and even the controls as Earth approached them. And then, just like Jean remembers, the flares hit at full force, and quickly, she realized their shields might not be enough. So with chaos breaking loose, Cyclops took the opportunity to stand before everyone and reveal his feelings openly to Jean Grey, because at that moment, Scott truly believed they all were going to die. But regardless of his confession of love, Jean had to jerk herself away, which caused Scott to fade into the background. For her focus had to be entirely on Wolverine, in order to keep them all alive. Now as their rapport deepened, Jean was able to learn more about Wolverine, more about Logan. And through that connection, his life flashed before her eyes as the radiation intensified and his healing factor struggled to repair himself. And during all of that intense interaction, she is able to see when his powers first emerged, when his claws first broke through his skin, and to her surprise, his claws were not made of adamantium, but rather, it was made of bone. But that wasn't all she saw, for she also saw his military service. She saw him back in World War I, as well as World War II. Which begs the question, how old is Wolverine really? But see, as she continued to dive through his thoughts, she ended up running into a blank wall, which ultimately was a hard stop in his memories, for the radiation is more than his healing factor can take. And because of that, she was losing him, but unwilling to let things end like this, Jean grabbed hold of his mind and started to push harder, adding her will and strength to his. And through their combined strength, the block within his mind shattered into thousands of pieces. And beneath it revealed terrible traumas that were even hidden from him. Because within that dark place, they stumbled upon a secret research facility in Canada. A clandestine military operation called Weapon X. And in that place, Logan was their prisoner, and the mad scientist, better yet, torturers, bonded the adamantium to his bones and strived to eradicate his humanity. But eventually, Logan ended up escaping with such anger, such destruction, and such courage. Until he eventually came to the X-Men in the hope of finding a safe haven, though he didn't know he needed one. Jean also seen that he doesn't trust the rest of the team yet, but she doesn't hold it against him. After everything he'd been through, how could he? But somehow, through some kind of miracle, he trusted Jean enough to let her into his mind. And in there she saw that he was willing to die for all of them, but especially for her. So with the shuttle hitting the bay, everyone emerged alive, with the exception of the man of the hour. So with things looking dire, out of the water emerged Wolverine. But just like Jean Grey in the original timeline, Wolverine was not alone, for within him burned the flame of the Phoenix. And as he emerged, his claws spread throughout his body, creating devastating spikes, for he is the Phoenix, rising from the ashes of his past, and he was dead set on making the ghosts that hunted him pay. So with a fiery intent, Wolverine shot across the sky, ready to make those who harmed him pay. For all his memories were back and was ready to be avenged. So, with that said, we fast forward back to the X Mansion with Professor X, pretty much talking to the entire team, and while talking, he brings up how they did a good job and how they were able to escape unnoticed from the crash site. And because of that, he thinks it would be a good idea for them to go on a vacation to Ireland and lay low until things cool down. But he failed to mention Wolverine's sacrifice and anything to do with him. Now this right here pissed off Jean Grey to the point where she decided to defy Charles's orders and refuse to go to Ireland in search of Logan. And with Cyclops being who he is, he volunteered to go along with her just for the fact to be close to her. So with that out there, we transition over to Canada, and while we are there, we get a dialogue from Jean saying how she always loved Scott since they were kids, but since all this has been going on, she hardly gave him a second thought, despite him bearing his soul to her. And to top that all off, whenever she closes her eyes, it's Logan's face she sees, and his voice she hears. So with that out there, as they approach the lab, Cyclops brings up how despite Jean seeing the carnage Wolverine left behind, she still loves him. And because of that, he knows he stands no chance. And that is when Jean responds by saying, "It's not like that, she just understands why he did it, because the people he is killing are the same people who put adamantium on his bones and try to turn them into an inhuman, anti-mutant killing machine. And they are also associated with groups like American Dark Ops, Trask and his Sentinels, as well as other anti-mutant fascist and hate groups around the world. And because of all that, when Logan first escaped, he killed the leaders, but that didn't stop them." And the crazy part about this whole thing is that Jean believes that Professor X knew about this. And maybe that was the reason why he recruited Wolverine, but when Wolverine transformed into the Phoenix, Charles decided to cut his losses and moved on. So with that established, when they looked inside the lab, the two saw where Logan was tortured at. And now to make things worse, the place where Logan was stored is now home to several more replacements. For Logan was just the first to be placed in those vats, because the mad scientist was dead set on creating an anti-mutant army. An army that would never come to be if Wolverine has anything to say about it, because following that, we see Logan completely cutting through everyone in the lab. One by one he sliced everyone down, with no problem at all. So with adamantium spikes flying across the lab, no one was safe from Wolverine's fury. So with the bodies piling up, Cyclops yells out to Jean that this slaughter has to stop. But despite his cries, Jean could only tell him that Wolverine somehow managed to shield his mind from her, due to him being in a berserker rage. In fact, he was so consumed by his rage that he didn't even realize that Jean and Cyclops were in the room. So with the situation going bad, Jean somehow managed to break through his mental blockers and reach the man within the beast. So in the moment of clarity, Wolverine makes a request of Jean, and that request was to end his life. So with the request made, Scott took it upon himself and unleashed his optic blast on Logan. But to his surprise, the fire within Wolverine was able to block the optic blast midway. And with his mission fulfilled, the Phoenix ended up leaving Wolverine in search for a new host, a host with a passionate hunger, a host like Cyclops. Because the Phoenix is a being of emotion and strength and reacts to its host manifest will. So it was only right that Cyclops would have been its next host, given his strong emotional feelings towards Jean. So with his visor broken, Scott and the Phoenix looked at Jean as she is, for the Phoenix is not a being of logic, for it thrives on Scott's feelings for Jean. And because Cyclops didn't want to be used by the Phoenix, much like Wolverine, he too asks to be killed. So with Jean unable to kill Scott, she laid a kiss upon his lips, but at that moment Wolverine also placed his claws through Cyclops' back as well. And at that moment, Jean saw the fire, leaving Scott and Flo back to Logan, answering his needs. Because within seconds, Logan used that flame to consume himself, and in a glorious flame, he burned himself to ashes, and all Jean could do was bear witness to the deaths of not just one, but two of the men she loved the most in the world. So with Scott and Logan gone, Jean could only reflect on her decision, for at the moment, Wolverine seemed to be the logical choice because he was able to survive the radiation and survive even the impact. But one that he couldn't survive was the Phoenix itself. So with that scenario hitting a dead end, Jean was forced to admit that her taking on the Phoenix was the best option that could have been done. So if that is not where everything went wrong, then Jean is forced to look somewhere else. Now with that said, issue number 2 of Jean Grey comes to an end. So with issue number 2 in the bag, we transition over to issue number 3. And when issue 3 opens up, we see Jean talking to Madelyne Pryor, saying how every time she deals with her, everything goes to hell. Because if Jean was being completely honest with herself, she would have to admit that she has no idea what is going on. Because one minute she is within her thoughts, and the next minute she is inside of a desert with chains binding her down. So with things not adding up, Jean eventually realizes that the chains that is around her neck actually belong to Madelyne. For in this situation, Madelyne's memories were holding back Jean Grey for a change, because for as long as Madelyne could remember, Jean's memories shackled her. So with that revelation coming to light, Jean for some reason could hear Exodus and Hope's voice, because back in Immortal X-Men issue number 16, both Hope and Exodus found Jean's body broken and in a trance. And through reading her mind, Hope finds out that all the mutants who walked through the gate were in the White Hot Room. But anyway, getting back to the story, Jean points out how she has no idea what is happening and how everything that is going on is not fair. But that is when Madelyne responds by saying, "You thought I would fight fair." Because Madelyne would never forget what Jean took from her, and for that, she will never forgive her. Nor would she ever forget about the disaster they called Inferno. So following that, Madelyne then goes on to provide a quick recap of the event by saying, Mr. Sinister, determined to possess a child from Scott and Jean's lineage, used Jean's cells to force grow Madelyne in a tube. And when she awakens, she was basically an empty vessel used to marry Scott in order to produce a child by the name of Nathan Christopher. But shortly after having Cable, Scott discovered that the original Jean was still alive, so eventually Cyclops ended up leaving Maddie due to misinformation. So with Madelyne cast aside, she found refuge with demons, and together they started Inferno and planned a demon invasion. And as things continued, one thing always remained the same, and that was everyone around her always ended up using her. But that is when Jean responds by saying, they were told both Madelyne and Christopher have died, but with a lot of hard work, Scott eventually found baby Cable asleep in a cryogenic chamber. But shortly after finding him, they were attacked, which gave the demons the opportunity to slip in and steal the child. So with Scott and Jean distracted by the battle, they missed the demons completely. So with that said, Jean considered, what if the demons never got away? What if they kept possession of Christopher? So in that moment, Jean told Scott to aim at the demon that took Christopher, and with a well-placed shot, Cyclops shot the demon out of the sky as Jean used her telekinesis to gently lower the baby to safety. So following that, Madelyne states, saving the child and removing him from the continuity may not necessarily work. Because a do-over isn't possible, because her maternal instincts would not kick in, and she will not forget about her rage. Because at this point all she cares about is power. But just for entertainment, Madelyne was open to see how things would play. And play out it did, because the first thing Madelyne of that time did was kill the demon that failed her, and upon its death an unexpected guest arrived. Out of the shadows, Sinister appeared on the scene, and with a snap of his fingers, Madelyne was in chains with Daddy Dearest going on, for he loved to gloat. And during their interaction, Madelyne discovered that she was indeed a clone. Now with Sinister deep in her brain, the demons looked on in shock as Sinister dismantled the Goblin Queen. So with the situation getting rough, Madelyne demon allies took it upon themselves to step in and stop the mental abuse. So within seconds, two demons flanked Sinister and prepared to kill him, but with a commanding tone, the Goblin Queen ordered them to stop, because in her words, Sinister belonged to her, and with her frightening power she burned Sinister into ashes. Now with that threat out of the way, one of the demons tell Madelyne to hurry and help him recapture her son, so they can sacrifice him to open the portal between Limbo to Earth so they can rule together. But unfortunately, Madelyne had other plans in mind, because she wanted to rule alone. So once again Madelyne exercised her power and proceeded to kill everyone in the room. So with no one else left to oppose her, she has now truly become the Goblin Queen and her reign is about to begin. Now, following that, we transition over to Scott and Jean Grey, arriving back to the city, and when they get there, before them is a giant hellish landscape because Limbo is now open. So as the two navigate through the new skyline, demons from all around attempt to take down their aircraft. But due to Scott's expert control, they were able to make their escape. Now, despite all the chaos that is going on, Jean and Scott still have no idea about what just transpired. All they know is that their main priority is to protect Christopher. So with their aircraft landing on their ship, the two thought they were in the clear until Madelyne arrived. Now, this right here came as a massive surprise to Jean and Scott. Because up to this point they were under the assumption that Madelyne was killed because they believed they saw her body alongside DNA evidence. But that is when Madelyne responds by saying dealing with DNA is Sinister's expertise. So with that out there, she proceeded to demand them to hand over Christopher because shortly all of them were going to die. And the first to fall was going to be Scott, because within seconds, Madelyne was able to complete incinerate Cyclops. But before he was no more, he yelled for Jean to save the baby. And save the baby she did, because within an instant, Jean took the baby and asked Madelyne, "Why Christopher? He's innocent." But see, to Madelyne, it didn't matter whether he was innocent or not. All that mattered was that she created him for a purpose, and because she was intending to use him as she saw fit. Because like I said before, his death is the key to connecting Limbo to Earth. So once it is open, Madelyne would be able to control both. So with Maddie fed up with asking, she decided to go on the attack. So within seconds, she let out a massive fire blast, only for Jean Grey to stop it dead in its tracks. So with the first wave blocked, Jean managed to find a safe place to store the baby, so she could focus on the enemy before her. But before she can resume her battle with Maddie, the Phoenix arrived on the scene with an offer. Because the Phoenix tells Jean Grey that it was responsible for bringing Madelyne back to life, so it could do the same for her. Just as long as she accepts the Phoenix Force as it is, both the darkness and the light. But due to Jean's standfast conviction, she rejects the offer because she refuses to be used the same way Maddie was. So with her decision clear, the Phoenix took her at her word and replied by saying, "Then you will die, Jean Grey, for every choice is yours to make." So following that exchange, Madelyne rips right through her defense and started to absorb Jean's energy. But luckily for our hero, she was able to break free and send Madelyne flying to the opposite side of the ship. So with the battle intensifying, Madelyne touched the ship and with her abilities, she was able to transform it. Because, according to her, she was able to control every atom that made up that boat. Now with the molecules as an extension of herself, she was able to turn it into a tidal wave and swipe through the city, because there was more than one way to rule the world. So with Jean Grey completely unable to fight back against Maddie, she ended up stopping the mental simulation and admitted that she once accepted the Phoenix Force power. And when she didn't want it, she sent the power to others. So with the constant rejection, the only thing she got in return was constant death. In fact, all her choices up to this point ended in death and destruction. So with all avenues ending in a dead end, Jean goes on to ask what else she could have done. And at that moment, many versions of herself replied by saying, "How should they know? She is the one in charge, because she was the one who created this mess to begin with." So with that said, issue number 3 comes to an end. But anyway, down in the comment section below, let me know your thoughts about this issue and what predictions you could have moving forward. So with that established, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget to leave a like and a comment if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.